Good evening, KI. Thank you so much for choosing to join us tonight for this really important conversation with a member of your community, a member of our community, Dr. Dr Klausner, who is going to take this opportunity to share with you and also to answer questions that you have. Before we get to the expert over here, I would like to just say that we are so appreciative of the ways that you've been in touch with us. We want to stay in touch with you. We want to do more things like this to bring us together as a community. On Friday night, we did our first online Shabbat service, and about 100 households were online for that service. So even if you were only with 2 people or 4 people in your house, know that you were joined by many, many, many more members of our community. That's what we're going to try to keep doing for you. We would love your feedback. We would love your ideas about things that you're interested in that we could bring to you online, like this really important conversation tonight. We are going to look at things as wide-ranging as yoga for stress relief with the yoga instructor that many of us study with and practice with. If you've not done Friday morning Torah study, this is a really good opportunity to check it out. And for those of you who are regulars, we want to keep gathering, and so we're going to have that over Zoom so we can see each other and be able to communicate with each other during those really sacred moments that have sustained us and helped us be the thriving community that we are. We will be answering calls. The calls are being forwarded to Masha. We are going to ask for your feedback. We're going to make sure that every message that you leave is answered. You can contact any one of us directly at any time. We are wanting to stay connected spiritually. We want to stay connected as a community, even as we practice the responsible thing, as our Torah tells us, of pikuach nefesh, of preserving life. And doing that by keeping our physical distance from one another. So send us your ideas. We're going to tell you more about how to do that in a congregational email. And we look forward to continuing expanding what our Jewish community can and should be right now in this very interesting and in some ways scary moment. To address some of that scariness. We have our amazing KI congregant, Dr. Dr Klausner, whose family we know and love. I've gotten to celebrate a simcha with them. That's kind of our thing here at KI. We get to have these moments of celebration and of holiness and of sacred gathering and moments of celebrating life cycle, transitions, and then we get to see you in your professional capacity. And he's here because he offered to be here. We didn't look on our list and see who might be a good person to call. We're here because I call him Jeff, offered to be here. He knows that this is a moment where what he knows and his experience can help us all navigate these choppy waters. So I'm going to ask Dr. Klausner to tell you more about who he is. If you're tuning in, it's because you've already read a lot about who he is. But I'd love for you to say not only like your creds, but like, what does that mean? Like, what do you actually do?
All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be able to share some responses, some thoughts, some way that I think about this current situation, this epidemic. So, as my wife Tammy says, it's really my Super Bowl. So, when you hear about my training, let's see if you agree. So, originally, I'm a graduate of Cornell University School of Medicine in New York City. I took an extra year during medical school. I went to Zaire in 1989 to help address the early AIDS epidemic there, and that's where I really fell in love with epidemiology and with public health. I was working with the CDC and WHO, and that time those were just alphabet soup in my mind. I really didn't know what these organizations did, but I felt a calling and a purpose really to get into public health. So while a lot of my colleagues were going into ophthalmology and orthopedics and remunerative specialties, contrary to my parents' wishes and desires, I decided to go into public health. And in order to be the most effective public health scientist and physician, I had to embark on a long training period. So after my medical school, I worked at Bellevue Hospital during the peak of the AIDS epidemic in the late 80s, early 90s. Emotionally exhausted from that clinical time, I got my master's in public health and infectious disease epidemiology at the Harvard School of Public Health. And then I joined the CDC in what's called the Epidemic Intelligence Service, or the EIS. And that's essentially the CIA of public health. And unfortunately, not like the CIA, no one's heard of the EIS. And the EIS is really our frontline public health physicians and PhDs who are really kind of on the wall there, on the lookout and responding to epidemics. Unfortunately, it's been a grossly underfunded program, only about 50 trainees a year. And the idea when it was created in 1951 was to have these EIS officers in every state, every city, and also back up in Atlanta at the home of the CDC. That was never fully realized, but at least I was privileged enough to be part of that training program. As part of that program, in 1995, I was assigned to the San Francisco Department of Public Health, where I got very involved with the early response to HIV and other STDs like syphilis. I could only enjoy my time in government so far before I wanted to go back to academics. I went to University of Washington, where I did my infectious disease training. University of Washington is one of our top infectious disease training programs in the country, and I studied there under King Holmes, was my mentor. And during my fellowship there in training, I was actually called back by the San Francisco Department of Public Health to come back and take over part of their public health program. So I was a deputy health officer for San Francisco at the young age of 34, and I did that for about 12 years, all sorts of programs with, I created a sex worker clinic, I created the first gay men's health center in San Francisco, we set up programs in youth detention facilities, outreach programs in vulnerable and underprivileged parts of San Francisco. And my family and I kind of grew up in San Francisco until about 2009, when I kind of felt I got as far as I could go, and we moved to South Africa. So I rejoined the CDC in 2009, and we moved Tammy, my 3 children, Henry, Teddy, and Anna, to Pretoria, South Africa, where I worked for the CDC as a medical officer for their AIDS response, and I assisted under the State Department the scale-up of treatment and prevention for HIV and TB. We did that for 3 years, and instead of sending Henry to high school in Johannesburg, we wanted to come back to California, and there I joined the faculty of UCLA in 2012, and over the past 8 years I've been doing research and teaching in epidemiology. I have an appointment in the Department of Epidemiology as an infectious disease epidemiologist, and an appointment in the Department of Medicine as a clinical infectious disease specialist. So I kind of have been lucky to have like both sides of the coin here. So not only do I really understand epidemiology and try to study it and learn it, but I also take care of patients, and I have a Monday clinics. I was in clinic this afternoon taking care of patients, and then for me it's fun because what I learn from patients then I can try to apply in research and bring back to the students in the School of Public Health. So for me, this kind of epidemic, while it's panic-inducing and fearful for many, this is kind of what I was trained to respond. And I'm happy to take questions and share with you my thoughts this evening.
But I'm also glad, as a rabbi, as a pulpit rabbi, as a congregational rabbi, I'm glad for you that you see patients, because I think that's what keeps us in touch with why we do the intellectual and other work that we do, and stay lifelong students of something we're fascinated by and interested in and love. What connects us to why we do it are the people I'm sure that you see in your time visiting patients. All right, so we've broken down the questions that we've received prior to the ones that we're getting online. I'm kind of in categories. So starting with kind of a general category. One question is, once you get COVID-19, can you get it a second time, or do you develop an immunity from getting it a second time? And what about immunity from mutations of the virus?
Okay, so like many viral infections, when we think of viral infections, we think of vaccine-preventable infections like measles or mumps, rubella, polio. Our immune system responds to those infections through the creation of antibodies. And it's the same antibodies that we use vaccines to artificially create. But when we have a natural infection with COVID-19, our body creates antibodies after a few days. Those antibodies then cause the virus to come down by binding and bringing in other components of our immune system to that immunologic response. And then we are protected from repeat infection. So there's excellent data in what we call non-human primates or monkey models where they have generated antibodies by naturally infecting those animals and then re-exposing them to virus, and there were 0 new infections. That doesn't mean that someone might not potentially have a relapse later on, or their tests might go from positive to positive again, but it does mean that they develop antibodies that protect them from repeat infection. And that's a very important concept in terms of how we understand this epidemic, because once people are infected and clear their infection, they essentially become human shields. And it's these human shields that protect the continuous spread of the virus in the general community. If you think of Zika, where did Zika go? So Zika came into Brazil, came into Puerto Rico, there was lots of cases, and then it went away. It didn't go away because we eliminated mosquitoes. It went away because a lot of the population became immune, so there were not enough new people to infect and sustain transmission of the epidemic. So I think that's actually a very important point to be optimistic about, that as more people get infected, they're going to protect others from the continued transmission of infection.
And I heard you say earlier, people have tested positive, negative, positive. That would be a relapse. But no one's tested positive, negative, positive. So that's the data that show us that people actually are immune and not relapsing. I mean, and that the other is a relapse?
Right. So, the tests, I'm not going to say that the tests are perfect. So some tests, can be called negative occasionally, particularly later infection when there's a lot less virus in the specimen, and then a repeat test can be positive. So we don't have a lot of studies with serial repeated tests over time, but in general, you test positive, you test negative, and you remain negative.
So what is your best guess? Someone's asking for the actual death rate.
So the death rate, there's different ways we think about the death rate. One's called a case fatality ratio. So that's the ratio of deaths over the cases. Another term we use is called the infected mortality ratio, and that's the ratio of deaths over those infected. So early on in the epidemic in China, there was a high case fatality ratio of about 2 or 3%. And that was obviously very concerning, that this infection that was infecting 80,000 plus people in Wuhan, China, might kill 2 to 3% of those infected. But then when we looked at the data a little bit more carefully, we actually found that wasn't true. That there were actually a lot of people who had very mild infection that didn't present to healthcare, people who had asymptomatic infection that weren't necessarily tested. So actually our best estimate of the infected mortality ratio, or among all those who were infected, what proportion will die right now is about 0.5%, or about 1 out of 200. That's still a high number when you talk about thousands and thousands that might get infected. In comparison, influenza is about 0.1%, so that's about 1 out of 1,000. This right now is about 1 out of 200. But compared to the prior coronavirus outbreaks like SARS, it was about 1 out of 3. MERS, or the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which is another coronavirus outbreak, that was about 1 out of 4. So this is definitely less severe than those other coronaviruses, but more severe than influenza. Additionally, what we've seen is that the fatality ratio is much, much lower in children. So there's been only 6 reported cases, which is, 6 is still unfortunate, but only 6 out of, tens of thousands of children under 15 that have succumbed. So it's generally felt that those under 15 have a very, very low risk of mortality and severe disease. And on the flip side, those over the age of 70 and over 75 have a much higher fatality, which may actually be 5% or greater. So part of our strategy now is to try to protect those older individuals because they have a much higher risk of severe outcomes.
So once someone is infected at that age, what is there to do, or is there anything to do differently because they're in an at-risk group? Do you go to the hospital sooner? Do you look for symptoms earlier if there are underlying conditions? Like symptoms that would mean I need to do something different other than quarantine at home and treat at home?
Right. So I was consulting on a patient today who tested positive in their early 70s. And I talked to their primary care provider, and I said, well, right now this patient is generally well, they have a fever and cough, but we want to monitor them on a daily basis. Do they have any signs of shortness of breath? But not just shortness of breath at rest, but shortness of breath when they take a walk. So when they climb up a flight of stairs, are they short of breath after that flight of stairs? So we call that dyspnea, or shortness of breath on exertion. And if someone has shortness of breath on exertion, they're going to have that before they have shortness of breath in bed or at rest. So if anyone has shortness of breath on exertion, that becomes concerning, and that person needs to contact their medical provider. They need to, get one of those finger tests for their oxygen saturation in their blood. They may need to get an X-ray and further evaluation, and then depending on if they need oxygen or not, may need to come into the hospital. The good thing that I'll talk more about is, we do have treatments available. So there are antiviral medications that are available through clinical trials, and there are antiviral medications that are available on what's called a compassionate use basis. So in the hospital, we are giving people intravenous therapy with antiviral medications that have been shown probably to have some benefit.
So that's some hopeful news.
I'm going to try to be hopeful. I'm an optimist, so I'm a glass half full kind of guy.
What is it about the coronavirus that is making it so difficult to test? Is it difficult to test, or do we just not have tests?
Right. So the testing fiasco crisis is an interesting story. So when the virus was first identified by the Chinese at the end of December, they identified it in a culture, and then they sequenced that virus through our fancy molecular genetic sequencing testing. And within 7 days, they posted the sequence of the virus on the World Wide Web, on the internet.
The DNA?
Yeah, the RNA
structure.
sequence. It was out there for the public to see. So quickly, WHO, the German government, CDC, looked at that and they started to develop a test. And WHO and CDC, that's what they do. I mean, they are there to help create novel diagnostics, new tests. But the CDC never has been or never was purposed to become a manufacturer, to manufacture and distribute thousands and thousands of tests. That's not what they do. It's like asking a research lab, to get into manufacturing. It's beyond their capacity. They're not supported to do that. So they created a test, and then they were kind of moved into this manufacturing distribution to other state public health laboratories, and they started to do that, and they had some problems with one of the controls. The control that's supposed to be negative was coming up positive sometimes, so that was problematic. So they finally realized, okay, we need to reach out to manufacturers who do this for a living, but because the U.S. government had declared this a public health emergency, now this organism and tests for this organism were reclassified into class 3 devices, which are high-risk devices. And for that classification, you need to go through FDA regulatory approval. So if they had not declared an emergency, it could have been just a normal laboratory-based test that we use for other infectious diseases. But because they did, it had to go through the FDA process. So now you get into the government bureaucracy and regulations and people going back and forth on the best thing to do. Ultimately now, major commercial laboratories do have tests available. Most academic hospitals and medical centers have tests available. As you know, humans are so innovative and entrepreneurial. There's pop-up laboratories appearing everywhere around the state and around the country. There's been drive-through collection sites in Denver. We're expecting to have drive-through collection in San Francisco soon, and hopefully soon drive-through collection and even mail order. So we've been contacted by online laboratory companies where you can, go online, request a test kit to be delivered to your house.
Like Ancestry or...
Yeah, like Ancestry.com or
23andMe.
23.com. So they already have distribution.
Right.
They already have internet sites. So it's ideally for them to be partnering with these laboratories. Instead of sending it for, Ancestry, they can send it for COVID-19 testing. So that's happening. And we expect, in the next week and in the week after, we'll have more and more tests available.
So people are also concerned, obviously, about what's happening just here in our area. And so people are asking things like, as of today, how many people have been identified as being infected with coronavirus in our area of, LA, West LA, Brentwood, Santa Monica, Pacific Palisades? Is it public information where the individuals with the virus live and work? Like, what do we know about what's happening locally?
So the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health sends out an email every day in the afternoon. They also do a press conference every day at noon. And on their website, they post the number of cases to date. And as of this afternoon, they're reporting 94 confirmed cases, which are 94 people who have tested positive based on this laboratory test. So that doesn't include people who have symptoms necessarily without a test, but includes people who have a confirmed positive test. And of those 94, 15, they haven't really identified where they got their infection from. So they call that community spread. But that just might mean that they did have contact from a traveler, they did have contact from someone on a cruise ship, they did have contact from someone with known infection, but it just could not be identified. So 94, in a population of 10 million right now is very, very, very low. However, we haven't had testing. So, everyone who's got a cough and a fever hasn't had opportunity for testing. But today, testing has really started, and at the hospitals and clinics, tests are available. So we're going to see a major increase in these number of reported cases. The Department of Public Health is actually quite stingy with the information it provides. It doesn't provide these case counts by zip code. It doesn't provide them by neighborhood. It doesn't provide them by sex, gender, age, or even severity. So you don't know, is this an asymptomatic case in a 15-year-old? Is this a serious case in a hospitalized patient in an 80-year-old? It would really help people like me to have some better characteristics of these cases.
So what's the reasoning for that?
Paternalism. We don't want to get people worried about these cases. They cite privacy, although, they're not providing, home
Names.
addresses or names or geolocating information. Most places are not providing this information. The New York Times, as people may know, provides information for the country. They're not providing, sex or age or a lot of specificity about the cases either. What also bugs me about the New York Times is they're just reporting cases and deaths and not the number of people recovered. So there's far more people who've recovered from infection than have died. And, we want to share the good news and not just the, bad outcomes.
What is the timetable, the realistic timetable for a vaccine? And should it have to await FDA approval, or can that be somehow speeded up, that process?
So as some people may know, today the phase 1 vaccine trial began across the United States. And a phase 1 vaccine trial is a safety trial. They just want to see, is this injection we give into someone safe? Is it going to cause an allergic reaction? Is it going to cause liver problems, kidney problems, nervous system problems? So they have to give that vaccine, which they've done, and then they have to watch those people for, probably at least 30 days, right, to make sure that they don't have any bad side effects. Then once they prove in, let's say, 30 people that it's safe, then they have to give it to another group of people, usually 100 or 200 people, to see, is it producing antibodies? Is it producing the type of antibodies that are important to control this infection? So that takes another several months, and they want to measure those antibodies over time, see how long those antibodies persist. And that tells us, is this vaccine immunogenic? Then thirdly, they want to do a field trial. And in that case, they want to give the vaccine versus a placebo or, saltwater vaccine to hundreds of people in an epidemic setting. So they want to give it to people where there's a lot of ongoing transmission. And then they want to see, okay, over the next month or two, how many people get infected who got vaccinated, how many people got infected who did not get vaccinated, does this vaccine work? And then once they have those three groups of data, actually along the way, they're always presenting this to the FDA. And then the FDA is prepared, and pretty quickly they can say, okay, this is approved for marketing. And then once it's approved for marketing, there has to be major scale-up of distribution and access and manufacturing, so that's available. So that whole process from this point takes 12 months. If everything goes well, arguably with this current administration, that's not something I would bank on, and so there's always, potential hiccups, hiccups along the way. And then also it requires people to take the vaccine, right? So even with influenza, which this year has already killed 22,000 Americans have already died from influenza. Older Americans, middle-aged Americans, children have died from influenza. 22,000. Only 50% of people get vaccinated. Right. So, let's hope we have a COVID-19 vaccine, but then we have to make sure people get vaccinated.
But I really had a hard time getting the flu vaccine. There's no vaccine. So that's another issue. Even with the flu vaccine, which is common practice and been around for a long time, there was no way to get it here. There were waiting lists at CVS, at the places people would go to get it. Huge waiting list. Unless your doctor had it in their office, you couldn't get it. So how much, kal vachomer, we say in the Talmud, how much more so the case for a novel vaccine?
Right. So one of the challenges with the flu vaccine is every year they have to produce a new flu vaccine based on the circulating flu strains in the southern hemisphere. And it's still manufactured in chicken eggs. So the manufacturers and the U.S. government actually has chicken farms all over the country in top secret locations that for national security purposes they can't release the location of these chicken farms, and they have to have 90,000 eggs a day. So they have to have lots of eggs to produce millions and millions of doses of vaccine. So it's a difficult process. It takes a long time. And one of the key differences between COVID-19 virus and influenza is that influenza changes every year. So this vaccine does not change in a way that this vaccine wouldn't work or that people would lose their immunity. And it doesn't change in a way that would become more dangerous or easier to spread. I know people always have questions. They always ask me, is this going to become a superbug? Is it going to become Ebola? And this is not the way viruses change and work in that way. Influenza does change its coat, and that's why it's so difficult to develop immunity, and that's also why it's so difficult to control influenza. Every year, it's a new epidemic. Every year, there's a new pandemic because it's a little different strain. COVID-19 is not that type of virus that's going to come back on a regular annual basis.
It changed in a way that we won't be protected from.
But also a key difference is that influenza viruses live in the waterfowl, they live in pigs and swine. They're constantly in this kind of ecosystem of these animals and then come into the human population. COVID-19 was introduced in a very unique, rare, unfortunate way. We think it lives in the bat population. A lot of these coronaviruses live in bats. Bats, I didn't know this, but bats are actually 20% of all mammals are bats. So that's a lot of bats out there.
That's a lot of bats.
And, bats carry rabies. Bats carry coronavirus. Bats carry Ebola virus. So there's probably like a reason why humans are kind of inherently afraid of bats. And it makes sense, stay away from bats. But what happened in this case is that bats infected these intermediate animals, these exotic animals. We think the pangolin. So a pangolin is a unique kind of armadillo with very large scales. And these scales in some countries have medicinal properties. They have sexual aphrodisiac properties. So
alleged
sexual
properties. Let's be clear.
Am I allowed to say sex in Tampa?
Oh, 100%. It's a mitzvah. On Shabbos, you get double credit. Shabbos and holidays, double credit, people who are isolated at home. Just saying.
Right. Well, that's also funny. That's what people are predicting. In 9 months from now, there's going to be a little baby boom. Right. So these pangolins are highly prized. They're also used for holiday meals, and it was like the lunar holiday season in China. So there's a lot of these pangolins available in these wet markets. So like in America, on Thanksgiving, we go for our turkey. Well, most of us may not eat turkey, on a regular basis, so they eat exotic animals in certain communities on a regular basis. So the bats, either through their poop or through biting, infected the pangolins. Pangolins carry this virus. And then it's not through eating the pangolin. Actually, it's by the slaughter or the preparation. So, as you know, Rabbi, the Israelites have very prescribed rules for slaughter of animals. And there's actually a rationale for that. And there's rationales for, these 613 rules. So, part of it is, to protect humanity. So people eat these exotic animals, jumped into the human species, and then went from human to human early, sparked outbreaks in these different cities.
And just to throw in a, thing for Judaism here and Jewish practices, I think it's also one of the reasons kashrut limited what we could eat. If you're slaughtering stuff that's going to cross lines, then that's dangerous. Like we were very limited in not only how we slaughtered the animal, but also what animals we could consume at all. And you couldn't find one dead and eat it because who knows what it died.
How it died, and if it died from an infectious disease.
Exactly.
Roadkill is okay.
Yeah, road pizza. For better chances of avoiding infection, now we're talking about kind of the category of prevention. Is it advisable to stay home if you are able to, as opposed to just limiting your outside circulation right now?
Right. So right now, you'd have to be living under a rock not to hear that, everybody wants people to stay home. And, in France, they won't say martial law, but it's essentially martial law. You cannot leave your house. In northern Italy, you cannot leave your apartment. In the U.S., they're making very strong recommendations that, unless people have to leave their house for a medical visit or some other really important reason, please stay home. There's some people think that that's completely, overkill and like unnecessary and overreaction, but that's kind of what the policy is. And the authority to actually impose these restrictions exists at the county level, which is interesting. So the federal government can make recommendations, state government can produce guidelines, but it's the county health officials that have the authority to close restaurants, to close gyms, to close movie theaters. And, when they do that, it's a very strong message, to people that we're serious. And it also, reminds people that they need to, stay home. We hear from Tony Fauci at the NIH, he's a personal friend of mine as well, that hunker down. It's time to hunker down for the next 2 weeks, and try to minimize your interactions with other people.
So I got this question, and I highlighted and starred because it's my life. So do young adults need to avoid all outside interactions to reduce risk to older folks? Should we keep social distance from them at home? And I wrote no chance in my house, but I have a 74-year-old partner and a 16-year-old daughter. So I think part of it is like, how much do we let her go out, and who should she be interacting with and not? And obviously we don't know who those people are, and yeah.
Right. So, I mean, the thing we do know is that one is most infectious when one has symptoms. So the key symptoms are cough and fever. People can also have a headache and fatigue like other flu-like illnesses. But when people are symptomatic, that's when they're most infectious.
Because of droplets that will then...
Right, because these respiratory droplets of the virus that when you cough or sneeze or get on your hands, can be on the chair, can be on the table, they can be detected with, molecular tests for up to a couple of days, but they're really only infectious for maybe 6 to 12 hours. So we want to, protect our vulnerable population by, minimizing kids, becoming carriers even for that short amount of time, recognizing, though, that's, difficult to do, obviously. And, kids, the risk consequences of them getting infected, they might get, a mild cold or illness, but they're not going to get severely ill. So that's a good thing. But, they can spread infection to others. So they need to, wash their hands. They need to, not share, drinks, dining utensils with, older adults. And they need to be a little bit more cognizant of, how they're interacting. But I think it's not going to be realistic to prevent kids from hanging out. And the idea of closing schools really comes from the early influenza epidemics, where influenza was spread much more easy than this virus, but it'd be spread a lot in schools, and then kids would come home and contribute to spread in the households and in the larger community.
And that flu epidemic, I understand, lived really well in young people.
Right. So there's been multiple flu epidemics over the past century or so. And
is this one the same? Does this live as well in young people, or is there a difference?
Well, live as well. I'm not sure what that means.
Okay.
So
Never mind.
Young people don't get sick. They have the same duration of infectiousness.
Well, with the flu, people were young and in hospital situations, a lot.
Right. Well,
more
I mean,
young.
comparing this to the 1918 flu is just wrong.
Right.
Right. So 1918, horse and buggy time, no antibiotics, no oxygen, no medical care.
Right.
And
I think that's helpful for people to hear.
yeah,
actually.
and people also, because it was World War I, right? Young people are packed into these barracks, so they're packed into very close living situations. The flu is zipping through all these barracks and tents and military training programs, and that caused a rapid spread of disease without any medical care or medical services. I think we have to look more at more recent flu epidemics to really understand more about the clinical consequences and outcomes.
So if someone gets the flu vaccine to help alleviate pneumonia in general, does it help with the pneumonia side effect of this virus?
Right. So the recommendation to get the flu vaccine, and it's not too late, to get the flu vaccine is that it'll reduce people coming into the hospitals with flu. It'll reduce phone calls to doctors' offices with influenza-like symptoms. The good news is that the past 4 weeks has seen a steady drop in influenza. And the hospitals are more open, the emergency rooms are less crowded due to influenza. However, because of this panic, more people are calling their doctors, more people are going into urgent care, into emergency rooms worried about COVID-19. So it's kind of like a zero-sum game.
I think this question is partly also about, but if you got the pneumonia vaccine, is it protective against the pneumonia aspect of this COVID-19?
All right, so it's a little bit confusing. So there's an influenza vaccine, and there's actually 2 bacterial pneumonia vaccines.
Right. Oh, so the bacterial
Right.
one.
So the kind of short answer is no.
Right.
These are different germs, require different vaccination.
If someone is staying in a hotel next weekend, is it true that germs, including COVID-19, can thrive on TV remotes or unsealed glasses that you would drink out of?
Yeah, so I think most hotels, motels are going to use, plastic disposable glasses. The ones you get in your hotel room, should be coming out of the dishwasher, but I guess you never really know for sure. TV remotes, yes, there always been notorious, germy devices. It would, make sense to use your, bleach wipe or your hydrogen peroxide wipe to, wipe those off. I think, we're going to be doing a lot more wiping.
If we have to travel by airplane for work or a family member, is it safe right now within the United States?
Airline safety remains our number one priority. So, it's safe. So there actually hasn't been well-documented airline cabin transmission. There's 15 air exchanges every hour in airlines. The airlines, they're...
And they have HEPA filters.
Right, they have lots of filters. They're doing extra cleaning. Airlines are doing a lot right now to reduce, concerns for infection. I won't go on a cruise ship right now, but airlines are fine.
What would you get in your community swimming pool or the jacuzzi at your condo?
Yeah, brominated or chlorinated water, that's how kind of bleach is made. So, that has a sterilizing effect against the virus. So actually, I don't see any reason to preclude that.
And so if we talked a little bit about, the exposure outside, who is it safe to have over? Our friends, our teenagers, our young adults, their friends. How do we know if they're not symptomatic? Do we allow them? How many, at a time?
Yeah, so I think, it makes sense to try to have, small. The recommendation now is under 10. Really make sure people do not come with any symptoms of fever or cough. I have this barbecue device I was trying to get working yesterday. It's this laser thermometer I use to, test the meat. And I was trying on my daughter to see if I could do this laser spot temperature and see her friends when they were going in and out. It didn't really work that well.
It didn't work.
But the idea is that we should be, thinking about it. The reality is that, kids, when they're meeting in the parks, in the ice cream shop, in their cars, there's a lot of passage of these vape pens now. Saliva is infectious. So, maybe we should buy our kids their own vape pens so they don't have to share. But, we should advise people, not to share those things, washing hands, and, we just got to do the best we can.
So looking towards prediction, people planning for what this is going to look like. So I'll give you a few questions. You can kind of take them as you want. How many rounds of quarantine might we need? 14 days seems to be the amount of time people are talking about social distancing. Does this seem like a realistic number, or do you imagine that it will be longer than that?
So rounds of quarantine. So, I think, if we're talking about this current situation where we're hunkering down, it's probably going to be once. And it's going to be for the next 14 days. The next 14 days are really going to be telling for the trajectory of the epidemic. Because I think some things I mentioned earlier about the temperature and humidity, that this doesn't spread well in higher temperatures or more humid environments, I'm not expecting, a lot of transmission in southern states or, particularly, sunny areas. So even Southern California is somewhat protected by that. But, more north in San Francisco, the Midwest and, the Northeast, we're going to see more cases, and there may be additional kind of spot outbreaks as, a few new cases seed additional, areas, additional cities or, living areas spark up, and that may, come over time. But I think I would expect, similar kind of decline in cases, through April, and, by April, the number of cases should be dropping way down.
Yeah, because one of the questions was, there's a simcha, bat mitzvah, scheduled to take place May 23rd. Are we talking that far out about probably canceling stuff? Or you're saying by end of April, if we do everything right, maybe it'll be...
Well, I definitely recommend, for travelers, get travel insurance. For, B'nai Mitzvah throwers, if it's possible, get, B'nai Mitzvah insurance, cater insurance, whatever. But, there's a very good chance May 23rd is going to be fine.
Okay. Please discuss the extent to which underlying illnesses, particularly in older people, exacerbate the risks of the virus. In particular, is asthma an illness that increases my exposure to serious effects, meaning it's as death?
Right. So asthma in children, it doesn't appear so. And there's a lot of children, unfortunately, with asthma. But that doesn't appear to be a serious issue. If the asthmatic patient's on steroids, that's potentially a problem. And it looks like with some use of steroids in the cases in China, that may have made things worse. It certainly did not make it.
For the patient?
Right. For the patient.
Because?
That makes things better. Well, steroids are immune suppressing. So they work by suppressing your immune system. And you need your immune system to fight infection. In older people, particularly with lung disease, their lungs just don't have the reserve. They don't have the kind of resilience and the backup capacity. So people with emphysema, people with COPD, people with interstitial lung disease, people who lungs are a little bit more brittle, maybe from prior infection. As the virus takes a hold and you have this immune response deeper in the lungs, they definitely do not do as well. Part of the immune system's response to this particular virus is to layer like this coat of like cement inside the lungs, and that prevents healthy oxygen transportation. So that's one of the reasons why people become low oxygen content in their lungs, and it's very hard to treat that, and we don't really know how to effectively reverse that.
That's the first time I've heard that. And I've read a lot. That is the first time I've heard. So the body lays down as a defense this cement to kind of lock the virus in place, or smother it, and then like you can't breathe.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So I mean, there's.
Is that how the 34-year-old doctor who discovered it in China died from this?
Well, so we've been studying like exactly how and why people die. So they can die by asphyxiation, which is lack of oxygen to the brain, essentially. They can die by drowning, which is fluid filling up in the lungs, and both of those have occurred. It's a little morbid for me.
Yeah, I know. If I don't show any COVID-19 symptoms, should I still be tested to determine whether or not I am carrying the virus? And what pharmaceutical companies are making drugs available to help some of the ones that you mentioned? And what antivirus drug and other drugs that you talked about are being given by IV?
Okay, so the first question was,
if I'm not showing symptoms, should I still be tested?
So yeah, so you can't ask me a combo question like that.
Right,
I
sorry,
kind of lose the
my
stem.
fault. Totally my fault. So start there.
Yeah, so if you're asymptomatic, no, you should not get tested.
Okay.
And no one's recommending screening. That's called screening. Like when we do colon cancer screening, you have no symptoms, we're looking for problems. With this virus, we're not looking for asymptomatic carriers yet. We just don't have the ability to do anything about that, and we don't have the resources right now. So if it was a very, localized epidemic, like we screen pregnant women for syphilis, we screen people for HIV, that's a different kind of public health approach. For this right now, we're not looking to screen people yet. If our testing resources increase dramatically, that could be an additional strategy.
And so I trust that because you are so wonderful and generous and amazing, that we could maybe have another one of these conversations as the situation, should it change, where we could have that conversation about, okay, maybe now it is a time to do that, and here's why, and here's what that would do, and here's what you should do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'll be looking forward to, feedback from this conversation. If people found it useful, if people wanted different, types of information, I'd be happy to come back. So people asked about drug companies and drugs. So one of the antivirals is called remdesivir, Remedisivir. People can Google that themselves. There's another drug called Emketra, EMCETRA. That's a brand name of another drug. It's an immunologic. There are a whole bunch of what we call small compounds or molecular molecules in development by major research universities at Emory and University of North Carolina, for example. There's also been use of old drugs and things like chloroquine or hydrochloroquine, which are drugs we use to treat malaria, or drugs people use to treat arthritis.
Yeah,
so those are anti-inflammatory drugs, and there's been some suggestion that there's some benefit in the use of those drugs. But, I mean, the real kind of big clinical trials right now are on this antiviral remdesivir. Now, remdesivir is only given intravenously, so it's not a great drug for prophylaxis. For
prevention.
Or prevention. So, with our flu drugs, we have flu pills, right? We have oseltamivir, known as Tamiflu, and that we can give as prevention. So a lot of times, if I have a flu case, I'll give the Tamiflu to the family members. In nursing homes, if there's a flu case, they give everyone, Tamiflu. So we don't have that pill version of this remdesivir yet. Hopefully, it will be developed into a pill. But it is available in special circumstances with special criteria in special settings for clinical use.
So I just want to start closing us out. I know we're close to time. We had a situation here with a parent of a teenager who was here one night who tested positive. The parent tested positive. The student has not and has no symptoms and has not yet had a test because she's asymptomatic. They won't do a test, as you just indicated. So what should we know as people in terms of when we know something about somebody, like let's say the parent of a friend of our kid or the grandparent of an adult friend that we or the parent of an adult friend that we have, what should we be thinking about in terms of, because they're a second degree tested positive, what do we need to be concerned about with associating with a family member, let's say, of somebody who's tested positive?
Right. So, I mean, this kind of communication is always very difficult, right? So you always want to balance, how much information you want to give people so they can, do things that will protect their health versus, creating more panic and anxiety. And, it's always easy to be Monday morning quarterback and say, oh, I should have given more information, should have given less information. But, usually you have a group of people who kind of are rational and evidence-based in terms of what the, information or recommendations, should be. So I think it's judicious to communicate early. It's judicious to communicate clearly. And it's, judicious to communicate to the people who it affects in terms of, who needs to know this information, that it can actually, do something about it that has some, value to them. I mean, at this point, while there are only, 94 cases in LA County, there may be actually 10 times as much, but even 10 times 94 is, 1,000 in a population of 10 million. So there's still very few cases out there, although arguably we don't truly know what the population prevalence is. And there will be more cases. We'll hear about more, more positive. So, I think people have to take precautions kind of regardless of, a known exposure or a risk. So that's what the, state and county leadership is asking people is take precautions now. Assume that, someone who has a cough or fever, might be infectious, and protect yourself with washing your hands, with staying away from work if you're sick, staying away from sick people, wiping down surfaces, and just being cognizant of how this thing might be spread.
Thank you so much for being here with us. We are so grateful that we have you on the phone. You have to know he's on the phone with us many times a day. We text him many times a day. He often says, I can't talk now, but I'll get to you in 45 minutes, and he schedules right on time a consult with us. We cannot tell you. We know this is an incredibly busy and stressful time for you and your family, who I love and adore. And so we can't thank you and them enough for giving us this gift of your time, and not just tonight, like all the times that we consult with you. Is there one final thing you want to say?
Well, I was going to ask you for a pandemic prayer.
So, Misha Berach Avatinu Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov, Imotenu Sarah Rivka Rachel v'Leah. May the Holy One of Blessing, who blessed our forefathers and our foremothers, may that same source of strength, patience, courage, hope, humor, and light be with those who are ill, those who are on the front lines, those whose genius and commitment help keep us informed and safe and actually confront the danger when it appears. May everyone who is ill, all who are stressed out about getting ill, all who love those who are ill or are worried about someone getting ill, including ourselves, may we all know a refuata nefesh v'refuata guf, a full and speedy healing, a healing that's both of body and of spirit. V'nomar, and we say together,
Amen.
Amen. Amen. Please be in touch with us, rki.org/coronavirus. We'll give you a host of information, including tonight's talk, which I believe Adam has recorded. If you look at your email that talks about what's been canceled at KI, you'll also find in that email the link to join us online. So for many things that's going online, Friday Torah study, Saturday Torah study, we're going to be developing more things so that we can be present for you, be present with you, and be present even sparsely with one another. So we look forward to your ideas and your suggestions. We are grateful that you joined us tonight. If there's any question that came out of tonight, please do not hesitate to contact us. We want to be responsive to your questions and your concerns. That's why we're doing this. That's why we exist. Thank you so much. Tzeit chem l'shalom. Go to your lives